Alright, so if you watched my most recent video, you saw my loss on the Tuesday night game. That was the round 2 of the tournament, and that was the last Tuesday in January. This next game is from this past Tuesday, so the 2nd of February, and it was round 3 of the tournament. I faced Ronald Shaw, and he did not play the first 2 rounds, so he had 2 half-point buys. So he had 1 point, and I had a win and a loss, so I had 1 point. And he was rated in the mid-1600s, so weaker than I am, but not weak enough that taken for granted. So anyone that's 1600 knows what they're doing enough that they can be dangerous. I had black in the game, which means that I had to be even more aware. So at first, I tried to think back to what I saw him playing in his previous games, the last couple months when I had been down in New Orleans, see if I could remember walking past his boards. And as I expected, he played C4, so the English Open. So I remembered he was a more positional player. He liked a little more closed positions, I believe. So this is kind of what I expected, and I was hoping that I would be able to maybe create some positions that were more open than he would have liked. Overall, I was a bit unsuccessful, and he didn't play the opening great, but I failed to take advantage of it, and in the middle game, he earned an advantage, and then pressed a little bit too quickly, gave me the advantage back, and we'll see the rest from there. So C4, I decided to play E5. I believe this is the first time I've played E5 in response to C4 over the board. I've been playing it a lot in Blitz, and I've been looking at it some, but I used to always play more of a symmetrical position, which leads to more positional chess and closed chess, which is not what I do normally in my non-English games. And so I finally decided to learn some ideas for playing against the English that fit my normal style. So knight c3, knight f6, e3, and I played bishop b4. And alright, so my notation apparently is already messed up, so let's go back, because this doesn't look right. He played d3 instead, which is why I played bishop b4. D3's a little unusual. If anything, you see e3, or you're going to see g3 or the other knight. This is creating some weaknesses on the dark squares right away, and you can see that the king side development has not even started for him. So bishop b4 makes more sense, since now that knight, the only piece he's brought out, is pinned. He follows with bishop d2, and I go ahead and castle. So it's always nice whenever you're able to castle, on move 4, without having to put any of your pieces on bad squares. So black has to be happy 4 moves into this game. After this, he plays knight e4, which struck me as a strange move, moving the knight again, but I wasn't sure exactly how I needed to respond to it. So go ahead and take a moment and just think about what you would do as black here, since this was the first think that I had to have during the game. Do I take the bishop? Do I take the knight? Do I do neither? So there are a couple reasons that I'm doing these over-the-board game videos. One is so that I go over them and learn from them, and it helps keep me consistent and helps me learn from my games, talking through them. Secondly, I want to give people a perspective of thinking from a club-level player, since I'm not a titled player or some really strong player. Sometimes when I watch their videos, I feel like I miss steps in their thinking and so it's harder for me to understand. So I'm trying to give some of those thought processes that I have to explain my thinking and decision making. So the first thing I look at is the captures. I can take his knight, I can take his bishop, and then I have to look at other possible moves. So I can play a5, I can play the bishop back to e7, I could play queen to e7. And so in this case, early in the game, there are a lot of candidate moves. Pretty quickly I decide against a5. I don't really want to leave my pawn on b4. I also decide against queen e7 because the bishop takes. Well, if we play queen e7, the bishop takes, queen takes, and then he takes with the knight. After he does something like this, even if he takes, I guess I've got check, so takes back. But I didn't think this position was great. Maybe, just looking at it now, maybe I should have given queen e7 a little more thought than I did. But I quickly dismissed it because I was worried about my knight on f6. And so I really only seriously considered the two captures, knight takes knight, bishop takes bishop. And I decided that I wasn't sure I liked knight takes knight. Oops, didn't play the queen. Because after knight takes knight, I thought that he could play bishop takes bishop. And now he's hitting my rook with tempo. So I went ahead with bishop takes bishop because now he's moving his knight a third time if he takes with the knight. If he takes with the queen, then I'm simply going to take his knight, and now my position should be better. So he took with the knight, and his king side is not developed. My king's already castled. I think black has probably better than equality here, but I have to decide on a good plan to proceed with to take advantage of that lack of develop on the king side. And unfortunately, it just wasn't easy to do. So I wanted to take advantage of it by opening the position a little bit. So I played d5. He took, and I took with my knight, and he immediately played g3. At which point I played c6, and I think c6 was just too slow. It lets him catch up in development too easily. I probably need to play maybe bishop e6, maybe knight c6, but I need to do something to get an additional piece in the game. As soon as I play c6, white's going to be able to go ahead and catch up in development, and I haven't really taken advantage of their lack of kingside play. So after bishop b2 or g2, now I play bishop e6, and he goes ahead and plays the knight gf3. And suddenly he's ready to castle, and I haven't really contested it. I bring my knight to d7, and he plays his knight to c4. And this is interesting because he did it before he castled, and he's targeting this pawn on e5. But he's not really threatening to take it. So I pull my knight back to f6 with the idea that if he takes and I take and he takes, I can play this queen check right here and pick up his knight. So by pulling back my knight from d5 back to f6, it indirectly guards the pawn because I'll be able to pick up the piece at the end. So I figured I'd throw this little tactic at him, see how he would, if he'd get excited and just take the pawn. But he was calm and simply castled, which is the right move. And now I do have to worry about that pawn sitting on e5. I play queen c7. He plays queen c2. and I play rook fe8. I want to bring this other rook, my a rook, to the c file or the d file, and I'm not sure which file I want it on yet, and so for that reason I used the f rook to cover the e file. I figure this e pawn's probably going to be lost or pushed at some point, and I'll play on the open file. So after rook e8, he plays rook a d1, and this was interesting because I kind of expected that he might use his other rook. I wasn't sure, but it seems like he also wants a rook on the c file at some point, so now he would have to move the rook again if he wanted a rook on the c file. But he also wanted to keep this rook over by his king at this point. So one of his thoughts is probably to push the d pawn, break open the center that way, in which case his rook should be well placed. And after he moves that rook to d1, I play bishop f5, just pinning that pawn to the queen to prevent any d5 pushes. So bishop f5 lets him hit me with tempo, and we go into a series of moves going back and forth with our bishops and knights that I thought was going to end up good for me, but just ended up bettering his position. And so after this series of moves where we're rearranging our knights and bishops, I think white comes out with the advantage. So his knight is on h4, I bring my bishop back to e6, he plays knight back to f3, and I don't want to repeat, so I go ahead and play the bishop to d5, at which he plays the knight back to e3, and I didn't expect this move. And after he goes back to e3 and I pull my bishop back to e6, now he plays knight g5 instead. Now suddenly he's had a couple free moves to get his knights on better squares. So it looks a little bit awkward to have this knight in front of the e pawn, but it's helping control some key squares on the board. And after knight g5, I realize that my bishop really doesn't have a good square to go to. Notice that if I take this pawn on a2, he can trap me, and I'm just not going to be able to save it effectively. So I was trying to look for a way to take that pawn, but it just wasn't going to happen. It's too easy for him to trap that bishop. So I play h6 to kick his knight away and force his knight to either go back or take my bishop right away. I didn't want his knight to be able to sit on g5 attacking my other weak squares and my bishop with him choosing when to take. So he takes right away, and I go ahead and take with the rook. And at this point I think white has the advantage. So the opening wasn't great for him, but he played the early middle game well, at least better than I did. And now things start to get a little harder, because if white's going to keep this advantage, they need to come up with a good plan to press that advantage, and he fails to do so. So he plays bishop h3, which I did not think was a great move, because it moves off the bishop off a key diagonal and hits a rook that really doesn't mind moving, and once the rook moves, the bishop isn't doing much on that diagonal. So my rook gladly moves, and it just goes back to e8. Remember, my other rook wants to be on d8 or c8, so I don't mind moving the rook just right back. It keeps my pawn structure nice. I don't have to worry about it. I thought briefly about bringing it over to d6 and trying to double up on the d file, but I decided that I'd just bring it back and wait to see how he develops. See if he wanted to bring his bishop back onto that diagonal or what he was going to do. So if he doesn't bring the bishop back, I think the bishop's kind of out of play, which is what ends up happening. So after rook e8, he plays, find my notation here, takes knight, bishop h3, rook e8. He plays knight f5. Now, while f5 is a nice square from that knight, because I cannot kick it at any point because of the weakness on h6, I realized that the knight wasn't really targeting anything either. So, like the bishop, the knight looks better than I think it actually is. Maybe he was trying to eye that d6 square, but there's not a good way to get it there. And even if it does get there, I shouldn't have too much problem with it. So after knight f5, I went ahead and I played knight b6. So I'm eyeing up planting a knight on the d5 square. Also, opening the file for my rook to come in. And once my rook comes in, I'll never have to worry about that d6 square, because with the queen and the rook holding it, he'll never be able to plant the knight there. In addition, it gets that last piece off that diagonal of the bishop, so there's no chance of any threats there. So it's just a move to get the knight to a better square and remove two of the only threats he had in the position, or possible threats. So he has to come up with another plan, and he plays e4. So I wasn't surprised to see e4, but it really blocks off his light squared bishop. So now, as long as I can neutralize the diagonal the bishop is on, it really won't become better by moving back to g2. And that's the real problem with e4, is that it blocks this bishop off from the light squares on the queen side. And by closing the position like this, it improves my knights. I think the main idea behind it was to try and prevent my knights from getting to d5, but in turn, it prevents his bishop from being as good. And my knights are going to be able to rearrange themselves to get to good squares, even if it takes a little bit of time, because the position is now becoming more closed. So after e4, I simply play rook d8, and I'm pretty happy with my position here. My knights, while they aren't doing a lot right now, will be able to get to good squares. I've got ideas moving this knight back here, maybe finding a way to get my queen to b6 at some point. I might bring this knight around. I didn't know what I wanted to do with the knight yet, but I knew that as the pawn structure solidified, either he was going to have to open things up at some cost, or he was going to have to give me enough time to let my pieces get where they want. One other thought I had was king h7 and g6 at some point. But I have my rooks where I want, and so now let's see what white's plan is. And here, he played rook d2. So the idea of doubling the rooks, I guess, was what I thought he was doing. But I don't think I'm worried about doubling of the rooks, since if he doubles the rooks and pushes d4, the e file will become weaker, especially the e4 pawn. So if he plans on doing that, he's probably going to have to prep it with the rook coming over and the bishop going back before he can really do any of that. And so I've got a couple moves to decide what to do. I bring my bishop back to, or my knight back to c8, because I wanted my queen on b6 in a lot of positions. And I thought I could move my knight to get rid of his knight, especially if he brings the bishop back to g2. Then I'll be happy to trade my knight off for his, and leave my other knight, with the possibility of jumping around. So knight c8, it looks weird to bring it back, but I think it's got some good possibilities, and it opens up my queen, also to the ability of a5. So, after knight c8, he rushes and he plays d4 right away. And as I said, if he's going to play d4, he probably needs to prep it with either the rook, the bishop, or both. And in this case, with neither, as soon as he plays d4, I simply take and he realizes that he can't take back without losing the e-pawn. So he doubles, and once he doubles his rooks, I go ahead and take e4. He takes, I take, he takes, and now that I'm up the pawn, I am happy to go ahead and get rid of the rooks. So now simply we have two knights versus a knight and a bishop, but I have an extra pawn. So with correct play, this should be winning for black, but I need to be careful. One thing I like is that my knight on c8 is going to get to this nice square d6, and my other knight is going to be able to get to this nice square d5, and so my knights are looking pretty good right now. So after his knight takes, I go ahead and play knight e7 to prevent his knight from getting back to f5, and then I'll go ahead and play the other knight to d5 and establish two knights in the center of the board. If he wants to trade off a set of knights, I wouldn't mind. I think that in this kind of position, I wouldn't mind playing my knight against his light-squared bishop. Maybe that's inaccurate, but I was confident in my ability to play the knight against his bishop. So after knight e7, he plays queen e2, and I want to do something with this knight so that my queen is free, and I jump the knight over to g6 because I thought maybe I could get into e5 and then maybe eye these squares later on. So if I can get a knight on e5 and d5, then things are looking even better. So knight g6. Afterwards, he plays bishop f5, and I don't think that bishop takes knight is a real threat, because having the bishop versus the knight is really his compensation for the pawn right now. And if he trades that bishop for the knight, he won't have compensation for the pawn. And the fact that these pawns will become doubled is not enough. So I didn't really worry about that. So after bishop f5, I play queen d6 to make sure his queen can't infiltrate. Because if his queen, knight, and bishop all infiltrate, then I could have problems. So even up the pawn, I need to get the pieces off the board before I can really take advantage of that. And he takes my knight here. I gladly take back, and then he plays bishop e6 check, forcing the queens off right away, which I think is a mistake, because as long as the queens stay on the board, the pawn is not going to win the game. Once I bring the queens off the board, suddenly the pawn is a threat to win the game. The reason the pawn is so powerful is because the extra pawn is not the doubled one, it's the 3-on-2 majority. So I'm going to create a passed pawn on the queen side, and there's really nothing he can do about it. And so that's the reason it's going to be winning. So after the queens are traded, I have to be careful, because if I play the natural move king f7, he immediately wins that pawn back. So instead of playing king f7, I play knight e4, and when he plays knight d8, I simply play knight d6, and his knight can't actually win any of the pawns. And that's the maneuver he missed. He thought he could trade queens and immediately win his pawn back, but he missed the maneuver knight e4 to d6, holding my pawn. So after knight d6, he plays knight e6, and I'm just going to try and push his knight back. Knight d4, king f6, try and get my king to the center, king f1, g5, king e2, and endgames are one place where I need to work more, so I'm sure I did not play this the most precisely, but my thought was I need to keep his knight and king out of my side of the board and try and push forward and gain a space advantage. So kick the knight again, notice it can't go forward to any of these squares, And so he plays knight c2. Move my king to the center still. b3, b5, f3, a5, and I felt really good about this position right here. And I knew with correct play that this must be winning for black, but I then had trouble coming up with the exact plan that I needed to have. So after a5, he plays king d3, h5, knight a3, and I play h4. He plays king e3, and I play b4, and b4 is probably a mistake, since it now makes it so that these pawns are kind of backwards and can't be pushed without giving him a passed pawn. So I don't think b4 was good. His knight goes back to c2, knight f5 check, king f2, g6, and as you can see, just by playing the move g6, I'm not sure exactly how to proceed. Knight e3, he offers a knight trade, and I take the knight trade, which is probably a mistake. I probably shouldn't take the knight trade, but I do. And I play h3. King d3, king d5, f4, we exchange. And in this position, I knew if I was going to win, I need to push c4 or a4 in order to win. But I wasn't sure which one to push, and I had trouble calculating which one was winning. And I thought that a4 was winning because I missed his defensive resource. But c4 is clearly winning in this position. So if I play c4 and he takes, I simply go here, and his king can't guard the pawn. And it should be an easy win. But in my head, for some reason, I thought he could play his king over, and I wouldn't have made progress. So I wanted to play the pawn break further away from his king. B takes A, c4 check, king e3, and then here I played king c6, which really, there's no reason to go to c6 instead of c5. So, sorry, c6 instead of c5. So I'm not really sure why I played king c6. At which point, he plays king d4. I play c3. He plays a3, and a3 immediately loses to c2, at which point he resigned. What he missed, though, is that let's see, in this position, when I push here, he should follow my pawn, and if I try to come over and win these pawns with my king, his king can get to b3 and hold the position together. Now, in fact, he's going to be threatening to push this pawn, and if his king gets to b3, I'm in trouble. Even if I play a move like this, oops, so I go here, he steps back, and I get to it I triangulate, so I get it to it after him. He doesn't have to back off because he has a3. So let's go back and look at the first position. So in this position, if I'm the first one to get there, now I have to come up with another move. And if I push the g pawn, he simply takes it. And if I move my king, now he can still play a3. Then I move my king back, and he simply is going to take here with check. So I'm in trouble there. In fact, it's possible for black to lose this position. Mostly this position should just become a draw, but unless I'm careful, I'm going to end up losing it. So I missed that his king could run around my pawn and get to b3 and hold things together. And for that reason, the A4 break doesn't actually work, and I needed to play the C4 break, which was just winning if I saw that his king had to back up, and then it's an easy win. Alright, so the opening went well, the early mid-game did not go well, the late mid-game went well, the endgame started out well, and then I just missed that defensive resource. So king and pawn endgames is obviously a place that I need to work on, since I need to be able to convert those one pawn advantages without being fortunate that my opponent makes a mistake. Because you always want to assume your opponent is going to have best play. So you want to play the move that they cannot win or draw even with best play, which was, as we said, the C4 break rather than the A4 break. So if you saw that, good. If you didn't, then hopefully you learned something from this just like I did. Alright, thank you very much. And after I play the next round of this tournament, I'll go ahead and post that too. Alright, bye.